I'm Jeremy Strick, Director of the Nasher Sculpture Center, and I am delighted to welcome all of you to this Nasher Prize Dialogues program with artist and Nasher Prize Laureate Doris Salcedo. It's wonderful to see so many of you here for this second program in the Nasher Prize Dialogue series, and we're grateful to our friends at Booker T. Washington High School for allowing us to share this space with so many of you today. Nasher Prize Dialogues is an international platform for public programs intended to foster awareness of sculpture and of the Nasher Prize, and to stimulate discussion and debate. The first of these programs was held last year at London's Institute of Contemporary Arts, and was a conversation between artists and curators about the position of sculpture today. As part of the Nasher Prize, we plan to present more programs, including panel discussions, lectures, and symposia in cities around the world on a yearly basis, offering engagement with various audiences and providing myriad perspectives and insight into the ever-expanding field of sculpture. Today, here in Dallas, it is my great pleasure to introduce this lecture with the inaugural Nasher Prize Laureate, Doris Salcedo. The selection of Salcedo as the first recipient of the Nasher Prize by our distinguished jury was a very fitting choice, as her work so thoroughly fulfills the goals of the Nasher Prize: to honor artists who have had a tremendous impact on the field of sculpture and helped advance the art form. Over the last 30 years, Doris Salcedo's work has persistently challenged the material and conceptual boundaries of object making, with a wide array of works that poetically consider and memorialize the lives lost to political violence, both in her native Colombia and around the world. There's a special magic to Salcedo's work. Though the realization of her initial ideas may require years of relentless research and investigation, the resulting objects appear uncannily self-evident. With her work currently on view at the Nasher, Plegaria Muda, we see small shoots of grass growing through the cracks of overturned tables as naturally as can be. How can this be possible? She often plays on mystery and expectation like this, finding ever new ways to explore how material can contain and convey deep emotional content, often about the most tragic and painful loss. Her perseverance in this effort is extraordinary. The results of Salcedo's stalwart dedication to her work have secured her acclaim around the world. She is currently the subject of an eponymous solo exhibition which originated at the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago and has just traveled from the Guggenheim Museum in New York to the Perez Art Museum in Miami, where it opens this month. Additional past solo exhibitions include the New Museum New York, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, Tate Modern London, Maxi Rome, Pinacoteca Sao Paulo, and Hiroshima Museum of Contemporary Art, Hiroshima City, Japan. She has also been included in notable group exhibitions, such as the 26th Sao Paulo Biennale, Documenta 11 Kassel, and the 8th Istanbul Biennial. And in addition to the Nasher Prize, Salcedo has been the recipient of numerous awards, grants, and honorary doctorates from organizations and institutions including the Penny McCall Foundation, the Guggenheim Foundation, San Francisco Art Institute, Universidad Nacional de Colombia, the Spanish Ministry of Culture, and Hiroshima City Museum of Contemporary Art. As evidenced here, this is an artist of exceptional accomplishment, imagination, dedication, and courage. It is our great fortune to have her here with us today in Dallas to speak about her compelling work and practice. Please join me in welcoming the inaugural Nasher Prize Laureate, Doris Salcedo.
Thank you so much for being here today and for giving me such a warm welcome. I find it particularly difficult to talk about images in general, but even harder to talk about my own work. I believe images are untranslatable in words. Through words, art can never be fully grasped. In order to talk about my work, I need to approach it in an oblique way. And for this reason, I will borrow the words of thinkers and poets in order to open up a space in which I will bring here today the presence of my work. Derrida, Badiou, Nancy, Celan, to name just a few, will be present in every word I will read today. My entire talk should have quotation marks. I have no intention to compare myself to Walt Whitman, but I have only written one talk that I keep changing, adding fragments, and transforming it in an effort to convey in a more precise manner the events and experiences I am trying to address when making a particular piece. Also, as time goes by, I have come to realize that in all of my work, I have pursued the same unattainable goal, in a failed attempt to be faithful to the testimonies given to me by the victims of violence. The attempt to be faithful to the experiences of the victims has confined my work into a fragile threshold, a threshold filled with impossible contradictions that will remain unsettled in each and every one of my pieces. I have come to believe these contradictions and paradoxes constitute my work's very essence, and it is precisely about these contradictions that I would like to talk today. It is strange to be here today about to give a talk on the work I have produced in the past 30 years, and yet with the absolute certainty that I am just a beginner who knows little of art. But on second thoughts, actually, there is nothing strange about this, because art is about not knowing. Art is a constant reminder of the fact that rules, norms, and acquired knowledge are insufficient to render visible those aspects of reality that, from the perspective of the establishment, should remain invisible, unnamed, and faceless. Lacan expressed this idea bluntly when he said that, quote, poets don't know what they are saying, yet they still manage to say it before anyone else, unquote. Art is not about knowledge. It exceeds knowledge. It is, as Kierkegaard wrote, about discovering something that, quote, thought cannot think, something impossible, something at the frontier of thought and desire, unquote. By now, I should be used to working from the unknown, since it is the situation in which I place myself every time I start working on a new piece. But I'm not used to it, because it is a paradoxical, disorienting, contradictory situation, appropriately defined by Kafka as, quote, universally impossible, unquote. In a letter to Max Brod, he stated the three impossibilities he faced as a Jewish Czech writer writing in German. Quote, the impossibility of not writing, the impossibility of writing in German, and the impossibility of writing any other way, to which, he says, he is tempted to add a fourth, the impossibility of writing, unquote. Impossible, then, is the word that defines for me the creative act, an act in which, as Jacques Derrida instructed us, one should only do what is impossible, that ought to be the impossible rule. Art's main task is to open up the possibility of the impossible, and for this reason, art exceeds us. According to the philosopher Alain Badiou, quote, it is what exceeds the stable borders of the presently possible, unquote. Art exceeds knowledge, and specifically the knowledge or present understanding we have of what it means to be human. The poet Paul Celan thinks that in every work of art, quote, even in the least ambitious, there is this ineluctable question, this exorbitant claim, unquote. For Celan, art is the impossible path an artist must follow. Art is en route towards a you that is constantly fading away from our grasp. And art attempts to make possible this impossible encounter. Working with art is synonymous of working with the impossible. The impossible is present in everything I do. Derrida stated that a work begins by the impossible, quote, not with the impossible as with some initial inquiry that seems impossible, but rather pushed or shocked into action by the impossible, unquote. The impossible pushes its way into my work again when, against all odds, grass grows underneath a wooden table, or when a shroud is made with rose petals that do not wither, or when it is necessary to build a wall downwards instead of the usual upwards. Sometimes my task seems impossible because each time I need to make a different, radically different piece to honor the singularity of each and every victim's experience. So different, I need to go from animal fiber to stainless steel, from extremely heavy to almost immaterial. As you can see from these images, I do not accumulate knowledge. Every single time I begin working on a new piece, my point of departure is a tabula rasa. I start from nothing. Every single piece I have ever made has always begun with the testimony of a victim of political violence whose experience is a requirement for the very existence of my work. And for this reason, from the beginning, I agree with Gilles Deleuze's belief that artists must be forced into an exercise of depersonalization in order to produce works that are far removed from the autobiographical and strongly connected to a political immediacy. The philosopher Alain Badiou goes even further when he argues that an artist's desire needs to be articulated from the point of view of the location of each individual in relation to a specific traumatic experience. The poet Paul Celan considers a similar idea. In his text, The Meridian, he writes that an artist is, quote, he who has forgotten all about himself. And in this manner, art moves with the oblivious self into the uncanny and strange, unquote. By later, on the same text, he argues that only the artist who speaks from an angle of reflection, which is their own existence, their own physical nature, can reach the mystery of an encounter. My work is based on experiences I lack. Therefore, it is made from an unfamiliar, unstable place, simultaneously strange and proper. It is made from an indirect perspective, a place of insufficiency from which a fragmentary, incomplete history is precariously told and retold. The place from which I have tried to produce my work is extraordinarily presented in this poem by Josip Mandelstam that I will read to you. What I am saying now is not being said by me. It's dug from the earth like grains of petrified wheat. For Badiou, a poem like this subtracts language from the manipulation of knowledge. It liberates art from habits, conventions, and cliché. He believes that art that speaks from the perspective of the unknown is the only one capable of speaking of our time. Paradoxically, the power of this kind of art for Badiou resides in the weakness of its sense, in the fact that it has withdrawn from the plenitude of sense. He writes, quote, "When one is ready to be outside of oneself, one will be able to speak poetically from a terrestrial anonymity, destined for everyone. At this point, the addresser either becomes absent or becomes plural," unquote. What count are the works, the experiences they addresses, and know who made them. In spite of the fact that the work always proceeds from a specific life experience, I need to create in each piece a radical silence. I believe art stands at the paradoxical intersection of silence and eloquence. Every one of my pieces goes towards a victim, but during the process of making a piece, I have to make sure I keep a distance in order to leave that person intact, untouched. The work departs from the singularity of an experience that is linked to suffering and pain. But once these experiences become part of a work of art, they should become silent and strangely neutral. In all of my work, I have addressed only one issue: political violence. I have focused on political violence not simply because I am Colombian, which in a way gives me a deeper and closer knowledge of its effects, but because I strongly believe violence defines the ethos of our society. Violent death marks the passage of a complete life into the industrial production of corpses that has characterized the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century. Death at an industrial and epic scale, but at the same time reduced to its utmost insignificance, trivialized, and as such inscribed into our normal everyday life. I believe art, on the other hand, can inscribe in our life a different kind of passage, that is, from suffering to signifying loss. And it is for this reason that for the past 30 years I have remained immersed in mourning, and my work has been the work of mourning. Palimpsest, the piece I am currently working on, deals specifically with mourning. In this piece, the ground cries drops of water that will join together to slowly write the names of those victims whose lives this society refuses to grieve. Each victim of violence has a name that we ought to name, but you think that the only name available for the great majority of people is excluded. Excluded is the name of those who do not have a name. For him, philosophy, and I would like to add art, has no other legitimate aim than to help find the names that will bring into existence the life we have obliterated, abandoned into the unknown. I think it is important to create this kind of art because, as Jeanne-Marie reminded us, the aesthetic view of death reveals an ethic view of life. When the aesthetic view of death collapses, Auschwitz became possible, unquote. An aesthetic view of life gives us back the dignity and humanity we lose every time a violent death takes place. I believe this kind of work plays a role that is quite similar to a funeral oration, and it begins at the same moment, the instant Derrida calls, unquote, the end, quote, the end of the world, unquote. My work addresses a person who is no longer here at the moment where she or he can no longer hear us, and it addresses them when there remains nothing to be said. This salutation of final adieu, according to Jacques Nancy, quote, gives the ruined world its dignity as world, and to the proper name, deprived of sense, it gives the totality of sense, unquote. I see my work as a topology of mourning, the only possible response I can give in the face of irreparable absence are images capable of conveying incompleteness, lack, emptiness. A work of art, as funeral oration, explores possible ways in which to formulate a poetics of mourning that not only affirms the work of mourning, it is what Norigana calls, quote, a work in mourning, unquote. It attempts to give back the sense, meaning, and form that violence took away from its victims. And Jacques Nancy again add that this poetics of mourning also, quote, gives rise to that strange turmoil of crossing through life for nothing, but not exactly at a pure loss, unquote. I have devoted myself to creating image of mourning, since images are all we are left with once a beloved person has been taken away by a violent act. But in the case of political violence, these are not the only images we are left with. Jacques Nancy writes that, quote, violence always completes itself in an image. It always makes an image of itself. What matters in the exercise of force is the production of the effect that one expects from it. The violent person wants to see the mark he makes on the being he assaults, and violence consists precisely in imprinting such a mark. Violence imprints its image by force, unquote. In my work, I have tried to inscribe violent death without ever repeating or reproducing the violent act itself, but rather responding with images that differ essentially from it, because I think it is important to generate images that oppose the symbolic hegemony violence imposes on us. I find the limit of the representation of violence has been an essential part of my work. The question is how to present violence in a work of art without violence. How can I generate images that do not reproduce the violent act while addressing it? Jorge Luis Borges has given me a possible answer. He writes that, quote, the imminence of a revelation that does not come about is perhaps the aesthetic fact, unquote. Borges' definition of art allowed us to conceive of ways to present in art violence without violence. This consists precisely in the revelation not taking place, in its remaining imminent. This type of image is the opposite of violence, which reveals completely. Violence is hyper-representation, as Hollywood and authoritarian regimes all over the world know very well. Marie-José Montagne says that the great sights of vision in Western art harbor a concept of the image that demands a void at the very heart of its visibility. What makes a work of art is, quote, that epiphany in absence that only occurred during an eclipse, unquote. For her, the image a work of art presents should be like an eclipse. Quote, what is an eclipse? An object comes between the viewer and the sun and darkens the world of empirical forms, while its outline is illuminated by the fire that it hides, but whose brilliance we are momentarily able to contemplate. This brilliance that we are momentarily able to contemplate is the only image that art can give us. For her, the sense a work of art presents is sense eclipsed, and the image should be an eclipsed image. Nancy establishes a difference between being there in the world and being image. The image of work of art presents, quote, is not there, but over there, in a distance, and this distance is called absence, unquote. In this sense, he writes that contrary to what is commonly believed, the imagination of an artist does not reside in the faculty of representing an object or a person in its absence. On the contrary, quote, imagination is the force that draws the form of presence out of absence. The absence of an imagined subject is nothing other than its intense presence, unquote. The experiences I try to address are not anecdotes. My work is about experiences taken from life. It is about the memory of experience, always vanishing. It is the vacuum generated by forgetfulness. The work of art is concerned precisely with that which is not an event. It points towards an event, or, again, as Nancy said, in a work of art, an event and eternity coincide in the intensity of its image. The events my work addresses are in the process of appearing and disappearing. Therefore, they can never be fully present. Derrida says that art articulates, quote, what is no longer and what is not yet, unquote. These sculptures are the only locus where these distant events take place. My work is a vain attempt to recover the irretrievable. More than inert, silent pieces, I see this furniture full of concrete as acts, hopeless actions, as though one could amend reality. In them, different times and different are juxtaposed because the time of violence, as Hamlet said, is out of joint. It is a dislocated time, and in a way, it is in this disjuncture of time that a work of art can open up a space in which to bring into our present the repressed and forgotten presences of the victims of the past. And yet, I could summarize my work with one word: impotence. My work is about impotence. It is a sum of impotences, not being able to solve anything, lacking the capacity of fixing anything, not seeing, not being able to reach a presence. In the aftermath of violence, we are caught between hope and impotence, and I hope this piece and land, this twofold experience is present, suggested by the difficulty to see clearly, and this difficulty bears with it a feeling of proximity, maybe the proximity of an almost possible present, but however, there is only absence. I have tried to inscribe my work precisely in the threshold where this absence makes itself present. In spite of the fact that I am a sculptor working with solid matter, I perceive this fragile threshold as something untouchable, like an image or a wound. A flor de piel is this piece that we're seeing now, is concerned just with this untouchable aspect of a wound. A flor de piel started with the simple intention of making a flower offering to a victim of torture in a failed attempt to perform the funerary ritual that has been denied to her. The genesis of a flor de piel arose when I began to wonder, how could I initiate even the slightest movement towards a tormented body, if only to present my flower offering? At this point, I began looking for the most fragile and the most of touching the untouchable. The process of making this piece pushed me to find the limits of the fragile and the most delicate within the frame of sculpture. The elaboration of a flor de piel represented a difficult challenge, trying to maintain a rose petal in a stage that is neither dead nor alive. I treated them so they remain suspended between the reign of the animate and the inanimate. I needed a shroud made out of rose petals that are simply sutured to one another. To me, making this piece represented the unattainable aim to shroud the extension of bodies torn away, of tortured bodies torn away from life and never properly delivered to death. This is a delicate and almost insubstantial piece. In a certain way, what defines this piece is our gaze, our relationship with it. It is a thin shroud, an interface that makes possible the idea of coming close to touching while making evident the impossibility of a caress, of healing, and of saving from the abyss of death. Violent death lays beyond the scope of art. Montaigne writes that death cannot be represented in art because it is the ultimate profanity, and as such, it escapes all symbolization. Death is not representable, and for this reason in art, quote, it is substituted not by the category of emptiness, but of hollowing out, unquote. Its content, argues Montaigne, should be emptied out to allow it to appear anew in the time and space of the sacred. And perhaps what the only thing art could do, the only thing art could represent, is the death of death. And this is precisely what I hope to attain with Plegaria Muda. Our society generates margins and exclusions in which it places the part of the population that in the eyes of the administrative powers are perceived as surplus, redundant population. This population is forced to dwell not only in the periphery of cities, but on the periphery of life. They inhabit the most external border of humanity, and there they remain displaced from the human genre. The process of investigating this work began in 2004 with a trip around Southeast LA, where I found an official report which stated that over 10,000 young people had suffered violent death on the streets of the city over a 20-year period. I focused my attention on the violence caused by the gangs, and particularly on the murky relationship that is established between the role of the victim and the role of the killer. After reflecting on this, I realized that this perverse and fluid swap between roles was possible because both inhabit an undefined gray area which some writers have called social death or death in life. Social death is experienced by people living in deprived areas under precarious conditions. Its consequences are tragic. One can easily see the connection that exists between this so-called social death and the subsequent violent, anonymous physical death. The conditions that generate this social death are quite similar all over the world, whether in LA or in Bogota. Plegaria Muda is a response to a particular event that took place in Colombia between 2003 and 2009, in which approximately 2,500 young people from deprived areas were murdered by the Colombian army and then presented as unidentified guerrillas discharged in combat. The death of each young person generates an absence that demands that we take responsibility for those who are missing, since the only way that they can exist is within us. Our relationship with them does not end with their death. It lives on as grief. As Hans Jos Frey argues, that in the face of death, the end of our hope survives as mourning, as a sign of the infinite incompleteness of our relationship with the dead. Colombia has been the country of the unburied dead. We have hundreds of unidentified mass graves where the dead remain nameless. For this reason, I needed to inscribe the image of the grave in this piece, creating a memorial, a graveyard in which to open up a space for each body. Plegaria Muda highlights each tomb individually. Despite not being marked with a name, each piece has been sealed and has an individual character, as if to indicate that a funerary ritual has taken place. The implacable and obsessive repetition of the tomb emphasizes the painful repetition of this unnecessary death. I hope that in spite of everything, life might prevail, even in difficult conditions, as it does in Plegaria Muda. I'll briefly present a few public art pieces that I have made in the past 15 years in quite different locations around the world, addressing, again, quite different events. But in spite of the fact that these pieces are site-specific, they all refer, and they don't refer to the same event, they affirm those aspects of life that are addressed to all, regardless of origins or difference in culture. I made 4 pieces based on the violent season of the Colombian Supreme Court on November 6th and 7th, 1985. A guerrilla commando took by force the building of the Supreme Court. The army retaliated in an equally brutal way, and as a result, a 2-day total war broke up in Bogotá's downtown. Approximately 126 people died, including the justices. On the 6th and 7th of November 2002, I presented this ephemeral work in the facade of the new Palace of Justice. This act of memory began on November 6 at 11:35 a.m., time when the first victim, a guard of the building, was killed. At that instant, an empty chair was slowly lowered along the southeast side facade of the Palace of Justice. This action was repeated several times for 2 complete days, the duration of the battle. The piece presents an image that respects the tension between remembering and forgetting, in which the survivors and families struggle year after year. The image I propose is at the intersection between the wish to remember and the impulse to forget. The piece I made for the Istanbul Biennial is a topography of war, inscribed in the midst of everyday life, an image where the private and the political collide, producing a complete sense of disorientation. The piece presents a sealed, circumscribed, and airless image. It is an intense, incessant piece, compulsively inscribed into an opening. On making emphasis on the flat surface, the stress is placed on detail, and what is offered to the view is a proliferation of detail. The more you look, the more you understand that its scrutiny is useless. The piece is made with 1,550 chairs that intercept up to the point where both logic and order collide. W.G. Sebald poses a question about how to form a language in which terrible experiences capable of paralyzing the power of articulation could be expressed in art. I asked this question to myself when making this piece: how to find a way to address concentration camps, both historical and their contemporary versions? How can we live a tranquil, peaceful, happy life, knowing of the existence of concentration camps today? This piece is an attempt to find an answer to these questions. Neither is titled. It's a piece about uncertainty and ambiguity. Neither is simultaneously located outside and inside the epicenter of catastrophe. I wanted to juxtapose an interior space with the utmost image of exteriority, a wire mesh. It is an interior space that negates the possibility of interiority, intimacy, and remembrance. The space is a fundamental category for any form of power. Architecture represents its potency, its social order, and its objectives. Architecture of power is made possible in this room at the Castello de Rivoli. I thought this room had an absolute and totalitarian character. The piece I installed in it emphasized both the form and the character of this grand space. It was clearly a space of political practice, and this remained evident today more than a century and a half after it ceased to be a center of power. Abyss, the title of this piece, Abyss is a tool to decode the history and nature of this impressive and at times unapproachable space. Abyss addresses the sheer extra weight the powerful ones exert over disenfranchised populations by simply building a wall downwards and then stopping just before the space becomes totally entombed. We know the worst moments of history have been defined by racial hatred. The rejection of the immigrant marks the trend towards separation, disintegration, and racism, and this is the space Shibboleth intends to delineate. Shibboleth, whose charge has always been to determine who can cross and who should die in the attempt, is placed here to mark the unbridgeable gap that separates humanity from infrahumanity. The piece is about absolute indifference. No cultural ornament articulates the desolation and destitution it is addressing. This piece is inopportune and apparently out of control. It intrudes in the turbine hall and its occurrence seems to be the product of an irrational event crossing through a rationalist building. Its appearance disturbs the museum in the same manner the appearance of immigrants disturbed the consensus and homogeneity of European societies. Although I am well aware of the fact that a critique of immigration is nothing new, I simply wanted to address this issue from the perspective of art, analyzing the role art played in the formation of the stereotype of human beauty. Western art constructed a radiant image of whites against the erased figures of all other peoples. Non-whites are faceless, and those faceless people have, through centuries, been those who must be hated and assassinated. In spite of the fact that these pieces are quite different from one another, there is one element that remains constant in all of them, an unwavering faith in art's ability to affirm the necessity of not remaining silent, even when addressing, as Mickey Ball says, those issues of which one cannot speak. Art is an act of faith, but faith understood, again, as an act. And it is through this act that I have been able to think of unthinkable experiences. The making of my work is like a solitary liturgy where the unbearable, the unknowable, and the impossible are accepted and forged into images capable of generating the yes, yes with which Derrida defines faith. For him, faith is a general affirmation by which, quote, we all respond to the language before language, which must be repeated from moment to moment to give us a reason to live on. Thank you. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we have a few moments for questions. If you would have a question, please come down to this microphone, or I believe there's one on the other side as well.
Can you talk about your work, how you created Cibele at the Tate Modern?
Do you mean physically or conceptually?
Physically.
Okay. The piece was made in my studio in Bogota, and then it was transported and buried in the building. So it's a very complex process. I work with a team of architects and engineers, and it works. Making these pieces goes from macro to micro. It's thinking of we're planning of a piece that is 168 meters long, and then our room for error was 2 millimeters. So we had to be absolutely precise. It's a very complex. I don't know. It's impossible to summarize that quickly, but it is. We made some molds out of gigantic stones, and to those stones we put some wire mesh, because I think whatever the earth opens in the first world, there will be a wire mesh to keep immigrants out. So the inside of the piece had, I think you can see in these images, it had a wire fencing. And then with dental tools, we carved the floor at the Tate. So it's a huge piece, but it has to be made with enormous detail and care. We really had no room for error. And I think that's the way art should always be made, no matter how big you attempt to make it. You have to be careful and in a loving manner finish every single detail, because you are addressing experiences that are painful, that are important for people. So you have to be extremely careful and loving in everything you do in your work.
Thank you.
Buenos días. My name is Bernardo Ballarino. As you can see, I'm Colombian as well. I'm a sculptor locally. I deal with the devaluation of human life, as well as kind of the disposability that we tend to treat it with. And currently, I'm about to finish my MFA, and you're a big part of my thesis. So it's a big honor to be here. One thing I wanted to mention, I wanted to ask you was, when I'm making my work and thinking about violence and thinking about those who are left behind, I myself tend to find thinking of those of the survivors, so us who are living, and life. So more the future rather than the past. Your work tends to work more in the memory. So when you're working, where is your mind on regards to the living?
I'm absolutely faithful to Walter Benjamin. Walter Benjamin taught us that if you want to think of the future, you have to rewrite the history. You have to look at the past. The only way to understand future is by being very carefully rethinking and rewriting the past from perspectives that were not looked before. In poor countries in particularly, we have always, history has been imposed to us. History has always been written by winners. So losers, for the first time, I think we have the opportunity to rewrite our history. So I see no difference between the past and the present and the future. We have to think the past. We must think of the past in order to place ourselves with dignity towards the future. Otherwise, I think it's impossible. So basically, the thesis of history of Walter Benjamin is what has helped me to hold my ground and look at the past obsessively and compulsively.
Ha sido un honor. Muchísimas gracias.
Doris Salcedo, we are so proud to have you as our inaugural Nasher Prize Laureate. And thank you so much for your time here today. Ladies and gentlemen, one more round of applause for Doris Salcedo.
Thank you.